Thanks so much, Secretary. Okay, so let's get down to business now. I think we're officially open. So a few little housekeeping measures before we move to the good gear with Jennifer Doleac. First up, let's just cover the issue of questions. So last year at the conference, Griffith did a transformational change in how you ask questions. You can still raise your hand and ask a question. We're very open to that. But if you are feeling shy or that's not really your preferred mechanism, you can ask a question via this QR code, which is on your program. So there's an opportunity to do that at any time during the presentations, and we'll present those questions to the speakers at the end of their talk. So just keep that in mind. That's true of all the sessions here. Now, there's 2 rooms that we're operating the conference in. All the keynotes are in this room, but the breakouts are in both this room and another room that's actually to the right and then to the right again. Hopefully it's probably a minute's walk. If you're attending the sessions in that room, just give yourself a little minute to get there. It's not our preferred layout, but that's the layout we're dealing with. So just think we go past the registration desk, continue along, and then turn to the right. And after today's presentations, we've also got a networking function that's going to be just here. So no need to travel anywhere, just same area that we're having our lunch and morning tea. Okay, so now it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the conference, Dr. Jennifer Doleac. Now, I have to admit that Friday afternoon we had a few hours where we had a little bit of a scare. There was a brief moment of panic where it seemed like Jennifer might miss her connecting flight to get her here from Texas. And look, we were looking madly for a plan B. You'd been promised one of the world's leading crime economists, and it looked like we were going to come up short. Now, I did offer to fill the hour with my thoughts on Erin Patterson and the mushroom trial. But that then proposed a new problem: would an hour be long enough? But thankfully, Jennifer's here. We're all grateful for that. So Jennifer's an economist and the executive vice president of the criminal justice at Arnold Ventures in the USA. She's the author of The Science of Second Chances and host of the excellent Probable Causation podcast, which many of you here will know as a go-to source for rigorous, accessible discourse on crime and justice policy. Jennifer's spent more than a decade as an academic researcher producing influential work on issues like DNA databases, prosecutorial reform, and risk assessment algorithms. And Jennifer has that rare gift of being able to explain complex ideas in ways that are both accessible and powerful, which is why she's so sought after by policymakers, media, and, as it turns out, Australian conference organisers. Her research has appeared in top journals, including the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the Review of Economics and Statistics, and the Journal of Labour Economics. And it's had real-world impact, shaping how governments and organisations think about crime prevention, desistance, and public safety. Jennifer is a strong voice for evidence-based policy and for not just asking what works, but how we know it works and for whom. In today's keynote, Jennifer will tackle one of the most vexing criminal justice policy issues: how we can better support people caught up in the justice system to improve their outcomes. Please welcome me Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Doleac.
Thank you, Jackie, for that very kind introduction. It's lovely to be here with you all. I'm going to help myself to some of this water before I get started here. Economists are not used to talking without being interrupted. So I've got 40 minutes here. So I'm very excited to be here with you all. Let's see. And someone will slides with me? How do I move slides forward? Or is this? Is this the slide?
Oh, yeah, that
Yeah.
probably is. Do you want to give it a
Oh,
yes.
beautiful. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, great. All set to go. Very happy to be here, and I'm really excited to learn about what everyone here is working on, the challenges facing Australia. Did a little bit of Googling as I was putting this slides together to make sure that what I was talking about would not be completely irrelevant to all of you in the room. Luckily, it turns out we're all facing the same problems the world over. So hopefully this will be somewhat interesting. Let me tell you a little bit about Arnold Ventures before I dive in. So as Jackie mentioned, I was an economics professor for many years, and I escaped the academy about 2 years ago. Now work at AV, which is based in Houston, Texas. We have offices in DC and New York as well. And AV is a philanthropy as well as a think tank focused on evidence-based policy. We focus on the US, but learn from wherever we can get our hands on research. And we have two goals. One is that we invest in research on what works, with a particularly strong focus on causal research design. So we really want to test what the impact of some intervention is out in the real world. We do that across a bunch of different policy spaces. I lead the criminal justice team, and in that program, we look for ideas related to crime, the criminal justice system, and people with criminal records. So it's a pretty broad scope. And then the really fun part for me as a researcher is that as solutions emerge from that evidence, we have a policy and advocacy team that can go take those solutions to scale. So that means that not only I spend a lot of time thinking about what works to improve public safety, but it also means I spend a lot of time thinking about, which ideas coming out of the research are actually scalable. Like, what would we do with this information if we find out that some intervention works? What's the lever we could pull to bring that program or policy to scale? And in some cases, it's a more straightforward answer than others. Okay, so I do spend a lot of time thinking about what works in public safety writ large, but I still spend a lot of time thinking about what was my main bread and butter as a researcher, which is how to break the incarceration cycle, how to help people who have some criminal justice involvement get onto a better path. Okay, so I probably don't need to tell people in this room that high recidivism rates are a persistent problem in countries around the world. The internet tells me that here in New South Wales, about 28% of people released from custody will reoffend within 1 year. This obviously harms individuals, it harms communities, and it also costs taxpayers a lot of money. This incarceration is really expensive. So breaking this cycle is a top policy priority. The bad news, I'll lead with the bad news first before we get into lots of good news. The bad news is that many of our well-intended policies don't work. Many more don't work as well as we might hope they do, or as well as they could. And some actually make things worse. So that's the context in which we're all working. The good news is that some policies do work. And the challenge facing, again, the folks in this room is figuring out which ones they are. So how do we figure out what works? First, we have to try new things. I find myself in lots of conversations with policymakers and practitioners asking for, would this dream program that they've just made up, would that be effective? And I have to say over and over again, we won't know until we try it, right? We have to be trying new things. If we want to get out of the equilibrium we're in, we have to be trying something different. So we have to keep coming up with new ideas, be creative, be innovative, come up with new programs and policies, and then try them out in the real world. And then the second step is where it's really helpful to have policymakers and researchers working together, because ideally we implement those new policies and programs in a way that gives us a good comparison group. This is much easier done ahead of time than looking back and hoping maybe we can find a comparison group in the data somehow. And we have a few options here. We can run, the standard randomized controlled trial. That's the dream, right? But often it's not possible, especially in the criminal justice space. But we can think about things like staggered rollouts. Maybe we can gradually roll a program out across cities or across states. We can have strict eligibility cutoffs by age or risk score or date. And we can even have random assignment of cases or people to different case managers or judges, different decision makers. So there are lots of options available to us, but it does help to have some thinking and planning ahead and researchers and practitioners working together. Okay, so we've got our new idea. We've implemented it in a way that we're going to have a good comparison group. What's left is we analyze the data, measure the impact, and then we just repeat and do this over and over again, iterating on what we're trying to make it work better and better, or to fail fast if something isn't going to work so that we can pick ourselves up and try something else. So what have we learned? Through this process, we're gradually building a strong evidence base on what works and what doesn't. The punchline is, I think, pretty reassuring. Big change and big improvements in outcomes don't require big structural reforms. That's good because big structural reform is hard. I think I certainly often wonder where we would even start to try to achieve it. It turns out we don't have to have big structural reform, although if people in the room are working for that, keep going. But it turns out that targeted incremental changes are enough to shift behavior in a meaningful way. So I term this The Science of Second Chances, which, as Jackie mentioned, is the title of my new book, which I'm now obligated to plug everywhere I go. So I'm going to talk in this keynote about a few of the takeaways from what we've learned here. I started with a list of about 30 things and have boiled it down to about 6 that I have time to talk about here today. This is not intended as a broad lit review, but to give you a taste of what I think are some big takeaways about what we've learned and can give policymakers some real direction. So 1 is err toward leniency for first-time defendants. 2, increase the likelihood that repeat offenders are caught. 3, use electronic monitoring as an alternative to incarceration. 4, provide cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, in prison. 5, use the possibility of early release as an incentive for rehabilitation. And 6, directly address employers' concerns about criminal records in order to increase hiring. Okay, so let's go through each of these one by one. The first is erring toward leniency for first-time defendants. And the policy question underlying this is really, what should we do with someone who's shown up in court for their first time, their first offense, whether it's a minor offense or a more serious one? And there's a lot of debate about this. There has been for decades, right? And there are 2 camps that have emerged. One worries that if we go too easy on people, they would become emboldened by the lack of consequences and recidivism would rise. Maybe they'll keep committing low-level offenses, maybe they'll escalate their bad behavior over time. So we should throw the book at people at kind of their first appearance. The second camp that's emerged is really worried that being pulled into the criminal justice system has what we call a criminogenic effect. It puts people on a worse path going forward. And so if we're too harsh, we actually make it more difficult for people to course correct and reintegrate into society. Okay, so we've got 2 camps. They could yell at each other all day long, so it's really helpful to have some data to take this to. So let me tell you about 2 studies. One is a study I worked on with my colleagues Amanda Egan and Anna Harvey a few years back, using data from Suffolk County, Massachusetts, where Boston's located. And here, it turned out that in the Suffolk County court, cases for nonviolent misdemeanor defendants are assigned to prosecutors in a way that is essentially random. So prosecutors are assigned to the arraignment courtroom, that's where the initial hearing is, in a way that they kind of cycle through based on what their schedule is. It's really unpredictable. And then whoever happens to be handling those cases on the day that your charge comes before the judge, that's the prosecutor you get. So it's, we can look at the data and say these cases look nearly identical, or identical. They look identical. And so it turns out that as in all cases I've ever seen where there are human decision makers in the mix, different humans have different preferences and beliefs about how much different programs or paths forward might be effective. And so it turns out that being assigned to different prosecutors means some defendants get lucky and they get a lenient prosecutor, and some defendants get unlucky and they get a harsh prosecutor. And we see in the data that being assigned to a more lenient prosecutor increases the likelihood that their case is simply dismissed at the initial hearing. For these really low-level cases, that's a totally possible outcome, right? The court just decides this isn't worth their time to deal with, go on your way. So And then what we find is that those who get lucky in this way, they are assigned to a lenient prosecutor and their case gets dropped as a result, those defendants are much less likely to reoffend. So future criminal charges fell by 53%, with the largest reductions for first-time defendants. 53% is a big decline, right? And this is a context, I'd worked in this area thinking about reentry outcomes and how to help people get in a better path after jail and prison for a long time. It's really hard to find reentry programs that work, really hard. And here we find that simply dismissing cases outright, especially for first-time defendants, reduces recidivism by over 50%. And as you can see in the graph, that's recidivism going down, and it's a sustained reduction for years. So that's one study. Oh, and I'll back up and say, when I first started doing this work, I think I was the real skeptic among the three of us as co-authors. I figured it was obvious that we were going to find there's some increase in crime, right? And the question is just what the trade-off is, right? I'm an economist. I believe there are always trade-offs. And so crime would surely go up some amount because there's some reduction in consequences, maybe a reduction in incapacitation. But the question is really, is it worth it? Because the court's saving all this time and there's so much less hassle for the defendants. And what we found is it was all benefits. There weren't benefits and costs we were weighing, as I'm used to. There was all benefits. We should do less and we get better outcomes as a result. So definitely surprised me. Another paper that tells us something similar is by Mike Mueller-Smith and Kevin Schnapel. And they were able to find, because they're overachievers, not just one natural experiment, but two in Houston, Texas, where I live. And I could go into the details if folks are interested in the discussion, but what you need to know is that these two natural experiments were policy shocks that suddenly, overnight, changed the likelihood that a nonviolent felony defendant received what they called a deferred adjudication. So these go by different names in different places, but the idea is that if they get one of these deferred adjudications, they're essentially put on a probationary period. And if they successfully complete that probationary period without any problems, then those initial charges are dropped. Their record's clear. And what Mike and Kevin found was that this second chance to avoid that first criminal record, so again, for the first-time defendants, was the biggest effect, there was a reduction in future convictions by about 50%. Again, very similar to the estimate that we had from our nonviolent misdemeanor paper. They were also able to link to data on employment, earnings over time for like a decade in the future, and found big increases in those outcomes as well. So again, the erring toward leniency, this doesn't mean dismiss all cases or give everyone a deferred adjudication, but basically, on the margin, err more in the direction of giving, especially those first-time defendants, a second chance, and you see that for that group, you see big reductions in future crime. So these studies came out at the same time that there's a whole bunch of other evidence that's been accumulating that I find really fascinating, that, for a long time, a lot of us assumed that these big long-term negative consequences that we seem to find for people who are in jail or prison, we assumed that came from being locked up from the incarceration period, and so mass incarceration is a problem for that reason. But there's more and more evidence coming out that it's not the incarceration that puts people on a worse path, it's the conviction up front. And if you compare it to people convicted, and you have variation in the sentence they receive, it actually doesn't matter much in terms of their long-term outcomes, in terms of employment, and so on. So the conviction turns out to be a pretty weighty bludgeon that we use for people. And if we're able to give people a second chance to avoid that first criminal record, then we can perhaps help them, maintain employment, find places to live. The criminal record makes it much harder to do those things. And in addition, it's really hard to undo the effect of a criminal record later. We've been trying that with various policies that I'll talk about later, but it's really hard to undo the effect of a criminal record once you have one. And so helping people avoid that criminal record up front can be really helpful. So the punchline here is that giving first-time defendants a second chance to avoid their first criminal record has big public safety benefits. And when I talk about this work, people will often say, well, great, we should decriminalize these offenses, especially the nonviolent misdemeanors, or they'll be really angry. This means there were no consequences for this bad behavior. That's not the way I would interpret this. Having to show up in court for an arraignment hearing, worry about what might happen, and then having your case dismissed was not no consequences, right? That person was arrested, they probably had to miss work for this. For a lot of people, that's a rock bottom moment, right? And it turns out, my interpretation of this evidence is that rock bottom moment is enough of a punishment for a lot of people, and that they'll course correct on their own. If they don't, they come back and we do something different for them next time. But it turns out that erring toward leniency for these first-time defendants helps them help us, reduces future crime, makes everyone better off, and then we can focus our more limited resources on the smaller group that remains. Okay, so it might be surprising then to have this as the second big takeaway, increase the likelihood that repeat offenders are caught. So the policy question here is, what's the best way to deter criminal behavior? And in some ways, that's very related to the previous question where people said, throw the book at them or let people go on their way. And indeed, for many years, we've certainly in the U.S., I think around the world, we're the worst offender on this one, is our general approach is to make sentences longer and longer, right? We try to deter crime by making the consequences of crime in terms of the punishment more and more severe. But there's now lots of evidence across a range of different types of interventions that the swiftness and certainty of punishment is what matters much more than the severity of punishment. And this is basically because people who are at risk of committing crime aren't thinking very far ahead. They might be thinking to tonight, maybe this weekend, but if you add 5 years to an already long sentence out in the future, nobody's thinking that far ahead. And so that is not going to factor into any decisions they make today. But increasing the probability that they get caught, going from what are often very low clearance rates in a lot of different types of crimes to something higher, that can have a big deterrent effect on crime. So I'll talk about one tool that does this for us, expanding law enforcement DNA databases. And these databases are well used around the world. Okay. So it turns out I have a couple papers on this. This was my job market paper many, many years ago now, what got me into the study of crime and criminal justice. I'll tell you about a more recent one with some colleagues from Denmark because they had much better data than I did. Basically, there was a big DNA database expansion in Denmark that added everyone charged with the equivalent of a felony, so more serious offenses, after the effective date of the law. So we were able to use this as a natural experiment, comparing people charged just before to just after the effective date of that policy. The latter, those charged after, are in the database now. Their DNA can be matched to crime scene evidence. The former are not. But everything else about these people and the environment they're in and their experience, the criminal justice system, everything else is the same. It's just whether or not they're in the database. And we found when we did this is that being added to the database reduced future reoffending by 42%. So again, huge effect. And very different from the effects we see for lengthening prison sentences. Those, fairly mixed results on that, right? But consistently we see in these studies about of tools or interventions that increase the probability of getting caught, really big deterrent effects on crime. You might be wondering in the graph there, the little gray dots right after the red line, that's when all the police were on summer vacation in Denmark. So we had a drop of those summer months, which is my favorite fun fact about this paper. I think the criminals were on summer vacation too, so it all worked out okay for them. Okay, so the punchline here is expanding DNA databases reduces recidivism. We see, as I said, similar effects for other strategies that increase the probability of getting caught, things like surveillance cameras, more police. A popular tool right now that my team is thinking a lot about is using drones as first responders. Could potentially really be very helpful in the policing context, avoid uses of force, avoid injuries to officers, and also potentially, identify the offender more quickly, identify evidence, all that good stuff. So the next questions here that are open for the field, I think, are what other high-tech tools are effective in this way? We shouldn't just assume they all work as intended, right? And some are going to be more effective than others, especially when you take implementation into account. And then, basically all of these tools work by keeping better tabs on people, which is some would call surveillance, right? And so there could be potential privacy costs here. And again, some tools are going to have bigger potential privacy costs than others. So how can we, as we're using these tools, also develop policies and regulations that mitigate these potential privacy costs? Things like, data retention policies and stuff like that. Okay, the third intervention I want to talk about is electronic monitoring. So the punchline here is we should use electronic monitoring as an alternative to incarceration much more than we currently are. And the policy question motivating this line of work is, it would be really nice to find cost-effective alternatives to prison that still protect public safety. We lock people up for a reason. There are a lot of people for whom prison is going to be our best option. But as I said earlier, prison is really expensive. And whenever we can find a more effective alternative, or even an alternative that's just as effective, we should take that. And I think it's useful here to kind of step back and think about why we lock people up. There are a few different reasons. One is incapacitation, right? So if someone's an active public safety threat, keeping them off the streets can protect the community. And then we have a specific deterrence and general deterrence, this idea that the experience of prison or seeing other people go to prison, that's going to keep you from committing crime yourself again in the future. We also hope for rehabilitation. Sometimes that doesn't work out as planned, and we wind up with criminogenic effects of incarceration that put people on a worse path than they were on, perhaps due to trauma or negative peer effects. Hanging out with a bunch of other people who committed crime maybe is not the best influence on you, but we might hope that it puts you on a better path if we can get you the right programs. And the last reason we lock people up is retribution, right? We think that if you've done bad things, you deserve for bad things to happen to you. And that has nothing to do with impacts on public safety. That's more of a moral and political preference that I, as an economist, have nothing to say about at all. It's something data can't tell us, give us an answer to. But we can think about those other factors and to what extent different interventions help or hurt us on those dimensions. So electronic monitoring uses GPS or radio frequency to track whether someone is where they're supposed to be. So for instance, they might have a curfew, they might be on house arrest the full time, maybe they're allowed to go to work or school at certain times of day. It basically provides some, but not all, of the incapacitation effect of prison, but it also avoids negative peer effects and might also be less disruptive to work and family life. So it might actually help people in those ways get themselves onto a better path. On the flip side, if people perceive it as a more limited consequence, not so bad to be on electronic monitoring, it'd be really bad to be in prison, then it could embolden people to reoffend. So this means we could have less deterrence going forward. So these go in different directions. Again, we could all yell at each other until somebody wins, or we can actually look at the data and see what the data say. So what's the net effect in the real world? And this is a place that you all are lucky to have great evidence from right here in New South Wales. So Jenny Williams and Don Weatherburn have this fantastic paper looking at what happens to cases and defendants when they're assigned to judges in a way that is essentially random. Again, one of these nice natural experiments. And they look at what happens to people who were sentenced to electronic monitoring instead of prison because they happen to be assigned to a judge who likes electronic monitoring, right? So you're kind of on the margin in this way. You get lucky if you get a judge that likes electronic monitoring. You're more likely to be on electronic monitoring yourself as a result. And those people committed 40% fewer offenses during the following 10 years. It's a huge effect, again, huge effect. Again, for just, people who are not saying everyone should be on electronic monitoring, not saying versus nobody, right? It's really just, you've got different judges with different preferences shifting things on the margin. It turns out electronic monitoring is also much, much, much cheaper than prison. So this isn't another one of those free lunches that, economists believe should not exist. And it's a win-win for everybody. I also heard Jenny Williams came on my podcast and told me that New South Wales is no longer using electronic monitoring in the way that they studied, which is a huge, so I'm here, I'm going to plead with you all to use it again because it really worked. And now in the US, we're trying to convince people to use electronic monitoring more based in large part on the evidence from here. Okay, so the punchline is electronic monitoring is far more cost-effective than prison. We have evidence from here in Australia. We also have evidence from the UK, from France, from Sweden, and a little bit from the US. We're trying to build more, showing consistent reductions in reoffending when EM is used as an alternative to pretrial detention or for short sentences or as a means of early release. So you could imagine using it for any of those different scenarios. And so the punchline here is that avoiding that criminogenic effect of prison, the bad influence of hanging out with other people who are in prison for crime and not being able to work, not being able to go to school, avoiding those effects dramatically outweighs any reduction in the incapacitation and deterrence effects. So next questions for the researchers in this room, I think, are how much further should we expand the use of EM as an alternative to incarceration? Surely it's not good for everybody, right? There are going to be some people who need to be in prison, but I think we're pretty far from the frontier where we would begin to see negative effects, given that in all of these different countries, expanding the use has such dramatic public safety benefits. The other big question is what additional requirements, if any, are useful complements to electronic monitoring? These effects are just the average effects as they're implemented right now. We could probably do even better if we actually iterated over time and tested additional programs. Okay, next up. Cognitive behavioral therapy. This is something, again, my team is thinking a lot about. So the policy question here is whether we can help at-risk youth and adults change their behavior, or whether we simply have to wait for everybody to grow up and age out of their impulsive and reckless decision-making. We can certainly do the latter. We know that age is a big predictor of crime, but that seems really frustrating if there's nothing we can do in the meantime to help people make better decisions. So cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is a form of psychotherapy that helps patients identify negative or inaccurate thinking traps so that patients can respond to challenges in a more effective way. It doesn't push people to make particular decisions. It pushes them to slow down their thinking and avoid automatic or impulsive reactions to certain situations. And I think the underlying intuition here is we all have scripts in our heads about how social situations go. And for most of us, that works out just fine on most days, but every once in a while we encounter an unusual scenario or situations that are very different from those that we encounter, say, in our personal life, and then we get ourselves into big trouble. And that might be more the case for people who are growing up in violent neighborhoods where they really need to be protecting themselves. Then when you encounter a cop, then things go really wrong. So it's now been tested in several randomized trials, which is wonderful, in the form of various distinct programs. They're usually implemented as group therapy sessions with different incentives to participate. I'll tell you about two of them. So one is by Sarah Heller and colleagues. This is one of the first big studies that came out, which looked at the use of cognitive behavioral therapy in a juvenile detention center. And they ran a randomized trial of the Becoming a Man program in that detention center. And what they found was that participation in BAM reduced 18-month readmissions by 32%. So it was really, really helpful for these kids. They also did some cost-benefit analysis, crunched the numbers there to see, that's a big cost savings, but the program costs money. It's not as cheap as electronic monitoring. And they found that the benefits in avoided social costs of crime were at least 5 times the cost of the program. So super effective. There's also a more recent study by Will Arbour looking at the effect of a prison-based CBT program in Quebec. He did not have, I went through each of these papers and looked for like the money graph, right? And he had a bunch of graphs, but apologies for no graph on this slide. But the results are still super, super compelling. So in that case, he was able to use the as-if random assignment of inmates to case managers in these prisons in Quebec. And again, as we see with other human decision makers, these case managers differed in their likelihood of recommending participation in the CBT program. Some liked it more than others. It turns out that the inmates who participated because they happened to be assigned to a case manager who liked CBT were much better off. They were less likely to have a violent infraction while they were incarcerated. And then they were 59% less likely to reoffend in their first year after release. So again, huge benefits. The other nice thing about this program is it's scaled across all of the prisons in Quebec, which gives you some hope that this is, it's not just like one trainer was really good or something like that. Okay, so the punchline here is yes, indeed, we can help people change their behavior. CBT reduces violent crime, both during and after incarceration. So the next questions for folks in this room are, how do we scale these programs most effectively? And that's something, again, my team at AV is thinking a lot about, given the evidence on CBT. How do we basically come up with like a CBT franchise, right, with effective programs that we can implement in lots of places? And then how can we convince more people who would benefit from these programs to participate, maybe even before they wind up in jail or prison? Okay, next punchline. Using the possibility of parole as an incentive for rehabilitation. So the policy question here is, how should we decide when to release someone from prison? We've already made the decision that they should be there. How do we decide when we let them out? And there are two standard approaches used in different places. One is what are called fixed or determinate sentences. A judge decides the sentence at the outset, and that's the amount of time that person spends in prison. And in the US, we call that truth in sentencing. That sounds, it seems straightforward to do it that way. The other approach is that we make people eligible for parole. They have a sentence, but they can get out early, and they have the opportunity to earn that early release based on program participation or good behavior, and basically a parole board decides whether they have earned the right to an early release. A lot of people really don't like this because they don't like the shadowy parole board deciding in a back room. They like the straightforwardness of a judge. So there are pros and cons to both of these approaches. Again, let's take the data, see what actually works better in practice. So the best paper on this is by Dave McDonald. He looks at a truth in sentencing policy change in Arizona that sorted inmates into treatment and comparison groups based on the exact date of their offense. So truth in sentencing policy, again, means that they have the fixed sentence, so there's no possibility of early release. So those who offended just after the date that the policy went into effect had no possibility of getting out early. So that's the right side of the graph. Yes, for all of us. Okay, great. And what he found was that group, where because they had no possibility of early release, they responded to that incentive. They were much less likely to engage in prison programming as a result. There was no point anymore because turns out that the main reason in their minds to do it was to get out early. So education enrollment fell by 24%. It turns out that they were much less likely to practice good behavior. Disciplinary infractions increased by 22%, making the prisons more violent and chaotic. And then all of that stuff mattered after they got out. Dave found that reincarceration for new convictions increased by 23% after these folks are released. So you see the people who were released just after that cutoff, their recidivism rate jumps almost immediately, right? And these results are in line with similar evidence from Georgia in the US that Ilyana Kuziemko had published about a decade earlier. So the punchline here is that the prospect of early release is a really powerful incentive that increases engagement in rehabilitation and the practicing of good behavior. So regardless, even if we all have different preferences about how long a sentence should be, it turns out that the data says we should implement those in a way that we use earned time credits and similar schemes to push those who are incarcerated to use their time in a way that puts them on a better path, right? So we can have the same average sentence, but different schemes for how we decide when to release people. And the next big question in my mind that I hope people in this room will work on is, what types of programs should count as rehabilitative, right? Right now, parole boards just look at all the programming and just assume it all works. we know it probably doesn't all work. So it'd be really helpful to have more information on which programs should we be prioritizing in prisons, and then give parole boards a little bit more information to go on. But even right now, with the average effects they have, they're doing a pretty good job, it turns out, of figuring out who is a public safety threat, who should get out early, and who should stay where they are. Okay, and now the last of my my big takeaways is a topic that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, so I'm going to spend a little more time talking about it. It's the policy question here is, how can we increase employment for people with criminal records? So we have a fair amount of evidence at this point that, and maybe just common sense, says that finding employment is perhaps not sufficient to building a stable life outside of prison, but is necessary. So necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. But we also know that many employers are reluctant to hire people with criminal records. So how do we change this? How do we get those employers to help society by giving people with criminal records a chance in the workforce? One approach, the most common and I think intuitive approach to a lot of people, is to simply remove information about criminal records. So if employers are discriminating against people with criminal records, perhaps we should just hide those records, right? Take the information away, then they can't ask, and they just have to treat everyone equally. That's the hope. So there have been two types of policies that, based on this intuition. One is ban the box, which prevents employers from asking about criminal records until late in the hiring process, at which point they can run a background check. But the hope is that at that point they've had a chance to get to know the person, and then they know, once they see the record, they have more information and maybe don't just reject them outright. The second of these is called clean slate. So this is sealing criminal records from view by anyone except law enforcement, usually after some period of time. Okay. So ban the box has been around for longer than clean slate, so we have more research on it. One of the first papers was by Amanda Egan and Sonia Starr. They ran a really cool field experiment in New York City and New Jersey, where they submitted thousands of job applications from fictitious job candidates, both before and after ban the box went into effect. And they randomized whether the applicant was black or white, or whether they had a criminal record. And what they found was that ban the box increased racial disparities in callbacks sixfold. And the punchline here, the intuition for this result, this unintended consequence, is that when employers can't ask, they don't just treat everyone as if they don't have a criminal record, they try to guess. And then they assumed black applicants were more likely to have a record and treated them differently than the white applicants on average. And so you can see in the graph before, on the left-hand side, you've got people with a criminal history on the first two bars, black is blue and green is white, and you see those two groups of applicants, the black and white applicants, are treated pretty similarly, but they have a much lower chance of getting a callback from employers than people without a criminal record, which are the next two bars. And again, the black and white applicants are treated pretty similarly. So what employers are responding to here is the criminal record, right? It's not race. And then the last set of bars is after ban the box, when they couldn't see criminal records. And you see that there's now a huge racial gap that's opened up. Employers basically use race as a proxy for whether you have a criminal record when they can't ask that information directly. I have a paper on the same thing with Ben Hansen. We were interested, so the cool thing about the Egan and Starr paper is they had a really clean experiment, right? You could randomize these different job applications. The one downside to that approach is they could look at callbacks for applicants. They can see kind of what they got a positive response from employers, but they couldn't see who actually got a job because these weren't real people, right? And you could imagine, I'll go back just for a moment. You could imagine even that last graph, or the last set of bars, some of those people might still have been rejected once the background check was done. So it's still kind of unclear whether people with criminal records are actually getting the job at the end. And there's also a question here about, this is using the set of people that they from their fictitious applicant pool, but in the real world, what happens to racial disparities in employment depends on the ratios, the size of these different groups, right? So if you have young black men with limited education, that's the group that is most likely to have a criminal record in the US. how much people with criminal records are helped and how much people without criminal records are hurt. Kind of the balance of that is going to predict what happens to the group on average. So Ben and I wanted to use data on actual employment to see what happened after these policies went into effect. So we used the staggered rollout of ban-the-box policies across the US as a natural experiment to test the impact of the policy on employment for young, low education men, again, the group that's going to be most likely to be helped if ban-the-box works, and hurt if employers are statistically discriminating instead. And what we found is that ban-the-box reduces employment for Black men by about 5%, reduced employment for Hispanic men by about 3%, no effect on white men on average. And so again, we see that these racial disparities really open up in line with the Egg and Starr paper. Even with all of that research, I think we all assumed a good number of people with criminal records would be benefiting, right? And we were really worried about the interesting question to us was how big were these unintended consequences due to the statistical discrimination? But Evan Rose was able to link really amazing administrative data from employment and earnings with criminal records in Washington state. And he looked at what happened when Seattle passed a ban-the-box policy. And he was interested specifically on the employment outcomes for people with criminal records. And he used a nice difference in difference design, comparing Seattle with other parts of Washington. And what he found was that ban-the-box had no impact on any employment outcome that he could find anywhere in the data. The likelihood of working, the likelihood of having any wages, the earnings, anything you could possibly measure about employment, nothing improved for this group. So what seems to be happening here is that employers are still rejecting them at the end of the process, but now, in the sort of best case scenario for some people is they get their foot in the door, they get an interview, and then they get rejected at the end, which maybe is, I've talked with people on the practitioner side who talk about how demoralizing that is for the candidates. So this is not working. This is not working the way we'd hoped it would. And so a lot of people looked at that research and said, well, the problem is that employers can still check backgrounds at the end. And so what we should do is just seal the criminal records, right? And so that's where, in the US, we call them clean slate policies. I think New Zealand also has one of these policies. There's a paper on clean slate there too. And so the idea here is that you can seal these records, and there are different rules about how long you have to wait. But this very cool paper by Amanda Egan, again, and a bunch of kind of all-star cast of economists looked at the effect of federal and state laws requiring that records are sealed after 7 years for employment background checks, as well as a big clean slate law that passed in Pennsylvania to much fanfare. And that law sealed all non-conviction records immediately, so there was no waiting period. And they found, again, they had incredible data, tax records, like, the kind of dream Scandinavian data that we don't ever have in the US. They actually had it in the US. And they, again, found zero impacts on employment in any way. There was, as I mentioned, a similar study of clean slate in New Zealand. Likewise, finds no employment effects of this policy. So again, this idea of removing this information is not helping people get their foot in the door. And the punchline from this, at least the Egan et al. Authors, their interpretation is that there's some, again, as I said before, having a conviction does lead to really negative, difficult consequences for you. You're much more likely to have trouble finding and keeping a job, but that effect is immediate. And so having your record sealed a while later is too late. The impact that it has on you makes it, you're more likely to be unemployed, you're more likely to be underemployed, and then 3, 4, 5, 6 years later, the employer actually isn't all that worried about your criminal record anymore. What they're responding to is the fact that you don't seem to have any good job skills. And so figuring out then a way to help people avoid that first criminal conviction, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is really helpful. And just highlights, I think, or we can actually do more to help people maintain job skills. So raises a whole bunch of other questions about what to do next. So removing information clearly does not work. There are big unintended consequences. There's even some early evidence that clean slate is having some of these statistical discrimination effects. So really we should be looking for something else to do. And I'll give you a couple of examples that make me much more optimistic that we will figure this out. So one option is what are called rehabilitation certificates. They go by a bunch of other names as well. But the idea is these are court-issued certificates providing a positive credential that can perhaps counter the negative credential of a criminal record. And so Leisure and Stephens Anderson ran an audit study testing the impact of these certificates in Ohio, measured again the effects on callbacks, and found that these certificates almost completely wiped out the negative effect of a felony record. So you can see in the graph, basically the first bar is the share of people who got a positive response from employers with no criminal record. The second bar is people who had a 1-year-old felony conviction, so they were called back at much lower rates. And the third bar is the people who had a 1-year-old felony conviction, the exact same conviction, but who also had a certificate. And you can see that that bar is almost identical to the bar for people with no criminal record at all. So this policy did exactly what Ban the Box was trying to do, get people's foot in the door. We don't know effects on actual employment yet. Someone should do that study. Another really cool paper in this space that, it's the kind of paper I wish I'd written. It was very, very clever, by Cullen, Dobby, and Hoffman, ran a big field experiment on a large hiring platform for temporary workers. This is where big fast food restaurants and so on go to hire people for, to fill in for people who are sick or something like that. And so the researchers asked hiring managers if they'd be willing to accept an employee with a criminal record. The standard practice was that those people were excluded. If they said yes, their hiring criteria on the platform were immediately changed. And so those people would be eligible for jobs. And so there's a strong incentive here to be honest, right? If they said yes and they didn't mean it, suddenly they have a whole bunch of people that they've hired who have criminal records. If they said no, then the researchers ran a randomized experiment to try different incentives or additional information to try to see what would get them to a yes. Okay, so this first graph is showing you different degrees of wage subsidy. So maybe one reason that employers are discriminating is that they think that people with criminal records are less productive, in which case maybe just subsidizing their wages could be helpful, right? And we have tax credits that try to do that, and with more or less success. And so what you see here is that the baseline, 39% of employers were willing to hire someone with a criminal record, and those bars generally went up as the subsidy got bigger. But even with 100% subsidy at the very end, these workers were free. Only 54% of employers were willing to take them, right? So there's something else going on here. It's not just productivity, right? So the wage subsidies, were somewhat effective, but other strategies were even more effective. And so you can see, again, the baseline here is that 39% said yes. Crime and safety insurance was offered as one of the interventions at different levels. This is the average. It pushed employers to 51%. And so insurance might be helpful if what employers are worried about is the risk associated with hiring someone with a criminal record, which is what, if you go ask employers, they will tell you is what they're worried about, right? Is that this person will commit another crime on the job or assault a fellow employee or something like that. And so this insurance, dollar for dollar, insurance was much more cost effective than a wage subsidy, which I find super interesting. Then they had some other informational interventions, the last two bars. So job history screening meant if they have at least one job where they've gotten a 5-star review in the past. And limited record screening means they'd be willing to hire people with some criminal records but not others, maybe just property offenses. So both of those are more information that might help address employers' concerns, obviously don't help everybody. So the punchline here, and something's going on with my slides. The punchline here is that directly addressing employers' concerns, either with more information or with incentives that reduce the cost or risk, that's much more effective than trying to hide information. So I think thinking of employers as rational actors that will respond to incentives, that's going to be a much more effective way to get them to help us by hiring people with criminal records than treating them as if they're sort of biased or making mistakes, which has been, I think, the default approach. So I'm really excited about these newer studies that are coming out. I think they point us in a really positive direction. And so the next question then for the field is, how do we effectively implement these strategies at scale? What does crime and safety insurance look like, either at the state or local level, maybe the national level, in a way that people actually take it up? So in summary, I'm almost done. a few of these evidence-based approaches that I think there's really compelling evidence that are effective in breaking the incarceration cycle, erring toward leniency for first-time defendants, increasing the likelihood that repeat offenders are caught, using electronic monitoring as an alternative to incarceration, at least much more than we currently do, providing CBT in prison, using the possibility of early release as an incentive for rehabilitation, and directly addressing employers' concerns about criminal records to address hiring. And here's the obligatory plug for my book. If you want more, this is just, I do think this is the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more we need to learn. And so I'm so glad the people in this room are working on this issue. But we do have a pretty good idea of at least some places that we could really push policy that would make a lot of people's lives better off. So I am excited to be here with you all to learn more of this over the next couple of days. And yeah, looking forward to questions.
You should just stay there. Fantastic. I'm desperate to know what the other, was it 16 or 26 items are that, but thanks so much for sharing that with us. I'm sure that it's piqued everybody's interest and really so on point for what we're here to discuss. So we've got some time for questions. So I invite people from the floor to raise their hand if you'd like to pose something to Jennifer. But I do know we do have some on the online chat.
The fancy app, amazing.
Should we just jump up there? Do you want to just introduce yourself?
Hi. It's a bit loud. My name's Melissa, and thank you for the presentation. That was really enlightening. I just have a question that I'm curious about in terms of the use of cognitive behavior therapy as a form of rehabilitation in prison. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on integrating the risk needs responsivity model in deciding the eligibility of participants and also the scalability of CBT.
Sure. So my general view is that we don't have a lot of evidence that the risk needs responsivity model works. I understand there's sort of like, we think of this as a data-driven approach, but it's all sort of like correlational, and we don't have great natural experiments yet, or experiments showing that using that method versus others is really valuable. So I think of this as being really like, should we have more intensive treatment for people who are higher risk levels? Maybe. I mean, it's one of those things that kind of feels intuitive, but these, where the experiments have been done, it's just the same program for all different participants at a bunch of different risk levels. So the effects that you're seeing in the papers are the average effect across those groups. But someone should test that. Someone should go actually look specifically at whether these different levels are effective.
Great, thanks. Fantastic. Suzanne?
Hi, thanks Jen for coming. It's so lovely to have you finally here in person after many, many years. Fantastic presentation. My question's around electronic monitoring. So we do still use it in New South Wales, not as an option under periodic home detention, which was covered by Don and Jenny's study, but more often as an option for parole or more recently as for bail. But thinking about your point around the importance of certainty and celerity, the swiftness of punishment, do you think a necessary condition for EM to be effective is a high level of policing of those, if it's a condition of your order or if it's an option that's been imposed by the court? Do you need to have that high level of policing to get that deterrent effect, or is it more about having an overarching threat of punishment, of going back to prison, that's what driving the reduction in reoffending?
Yeah, great question. So the results we're seeing across these papers are the effects of EM as they're implemented in these different countries, right? And so I think there's surely variation across these different settings and how likely it is that you're actually detected and how quickly it's detected if you've broken curfew, for instance. I know, I feel like when I first started reading these different papers, I was shocked that that we actually do use these radio frequency, just like you're either in your house or not. We're not actually tracking people over time. It's like we've got the technology, our phones follow us around. Like, why don't we have this for people on EM? But my hunch, I think, is probably the same as yours, that if we were to increase the probability that violations are detected, that it would be even more effective than it is now. So figuring out how to do that well would be really helpful.
Great, thanks.
Sorry, I've got
Sorry, Amanda, do you want to?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Dara Reid from Legal Aid New South Wales. I was paying close attention and noted the research about CBT for young people in detention. I was interested to know whether it's possible to extrapolate the other findings that you were referring to, in particular about first-time offending and things like that. I assume that was the adult population, whether you can extrapolate those findings to apply to young people or not.
So the question is about whether CBT would be more effective for first-timers or the first...
Sorry, that wasn't clear. I was wondering in terms of the research that seemed to be focusing on adults and those findings,
Yes.
whether the findings could be applied to young people as well.
Good question. I think that in a lot of cases, the best evidence we have either doesn't really distinguish these two things, or there's just a power challenge. And honestly, in at least the U.S. context, it's really difficult to get juvenile records, so there isn't a whole lot of research on juveniles, which is a big gap. But I'm thinking even my DNA database paper in Denmark, we found by far the biggest effects for younger adults, so like age 18 to 25. They had much bigger effects than any other group. I think in general, the intuition across that my takeaway from all these different papers is like kind of the earlier we can catch people in their criminal careers, so to speak, the more likely it is that we can get them onto a better path. It just becomes harder as people become pulled more and more into the system. So seems reasonable to me that doing a lot of this stuff for young people before they hit 18 would be smart.
Thanks. I might ask one of the questions that's on the chat. And so, Jennifer, do you have any tips for some of the items on your preferred methods would fall in, some people would think they're soft on crime. How can we convince governments to kind of follow the research and follow the evidence for these methods when they do have the public are calling for harsher treatment of offenders?
Right. Yeah, we have this conversation on my team a lot as well, as we are spending a lot of time trying to convince policymakers to do this stuff. One thing that I think is helpful is that we bring a menu of options that some might seem soft on crime and some might seem tough on crime, right? And basically, we're trying to be the objective stewards of evidence, saying this doesn't have, we're not on either political party's team, right? We're just telling you, like, sometimes the evidence it says this side's right, and sometimes the evidence says this side's right. And so hopefully that makes us more trustworthy in that way. There are, I think, sometimes positioning things. I think one obvious answer is if the data is showing it reduces crime, then it makes it a tough on crime policy, right? But I hear you that's not necessarily what the politicians mean or what the voters mean. I'll give you one example where we're trying to use the evidence in a way to provide more opportunity for common ground. Is a lot of lawmakers. Again, their impulse when they know their constituents are worried about crime rates is let's make sentences longer. And so we've had the last few years, we have a lot of states that have been, where legislators have really been pushing for truth in sentencing laws or sentencing enhancements or 3 strikes laws or any kind of policy that just makes sentences longer. And so we come in and we say, you could do that. That would probably reduce crime a little bit on the margin, but it's really expensive. And if you put all of that money into increasing the probability of getting caught instead, you would see a much bigger benefit. So if you if you spent the same amount of money on building another prison or, having more police on the streets, DNA databases, cameras, you'd see a much bigger reduction in crime rates by doing this one over here. And that gives the conservatives permission to come do this, because that also seems tough on crime, right? And it also brings the more liberal folks to the table because they don't want the long sentences. And so there's it turns out there's just evidence-based middle ground. But I think the other thing that I try to raise when I talk about this is, and part of the reason I put it into the presentation, there are a few different reasons that we lock people up, for instance. And one of them is retribution. And I think just being able to name that and say, like, one reason we use punishment and we use these consequences in the criminal justice system is because we just think you deserve it, right? And and that's completely separate. That's valid. Like, I'm an economist, I'm not gonna tell anybody what to think. Your preferences are as valid as mine. And there's no way data can tell us who's right about that. But even conditioning on that, kind of just like hold that is what it is. We probably all care at least somewhat about what the public safety consequences of our policies are. And so in that case, we can go measure that with data and see which of these are actually more effective than others. But if in the end you want to lock people up for 40 years because you just think they deserve it, well, that's fine, go do that. But if you want to know what actually works to make communities safer, then let's go look at the data.
Thanks, Jen. Now, there was a sea of hands, so I'm going to give one more. Luke, fantastic.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Luke Grant from Corrective Services. Hi. In your preamble to the discussion about employment, you talked about the common sense association between employment and reoffending. And people often draw the same association with housing and post-release accommodation, halfway houses, and yet high-quality evidence consistently fails to demonstrate an effect. Yeah. Is that because of the quality of the evidence, do you think, or is there something else going on, or do you agree with that premise that the evidence around accommodation is poor?
No, I think there's, this scenario, I wish we had more evidence in thinking about different types of housing interventions, but these halfway houses, I agree, it's not, the papers I've seen, I'm thinking of one in particular, finds that being assigned to different caseworkers that are more or less likely to assign you to a halfway house, those that get lucky and get the case manager that signs you up for the halfway house, those people are actually more likely to go back to prison, not less. And what seems to be happening there is that I think two things. One is you're not just in housing, you're in housing within the criminal justice system, and so you've got more supervision. And so you have the more opportunity for technical violations that may or may not actually be helping you avoid crime, but are more likely to send you back to prison. This is one of the topics I dropped, was intensity of supervision. And so that's part of it. I think the other part is you're grouped into a house with a bunch of other people who are also trying to transition out of prison. And grouping people together means sometimes you wind up with violent conflict that, is an assault. And so I think halfway houses have, I haven't seen great evidence that they work. Let's just say that. The only evidence I've seen that I think of as plausibly causal is showing that they don't work. That's different from research I've seen on just making housing available just to the broader community and the effect on people with criminal records, and that seems helpful. So thinking, what does housing mean, I guess, becomes the question. But this is a place I think we need a lot more work.
Fantastic. Look, I think the clock has got us. So, Jason, you test me. I'll give Jason a question because, it's our duty as co-host to Griffith to give them the microphone when they want it, I think.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was a wonderful presentation. And can I thank you on behalf of Griffith University for being here and, of course, Boxer for organising this. I want to take a moment to stitch two of your ideas together. The last one says that people perhaps are biased in their decision-making. Mm-hmm. And one of the first ones says we should apply, for example, new policies that increase the risk of detection for those who are second-time or third-time offenders. Mm-hmm. And my question really is, because we know in Australia that when we do that, it tends to have a disproportionate effect on disadvantaged populations, including our First Nations people. Mm-hmm. So how do we balance, for example, those issues that relate to the way in which people make decisions in the criminal justice system with the kinds of policies that you're suggesting increase the risk of detection post-conviction?
Yeah. Great question. My general view is that the more we can take the human decision makers out of the equation, the more we can avoid the bias, right? And I think this is counter often to the conventional wisdom about, the more you have these high-tech tools around, the more you wind up with disadvantaged communities being policed, and that has a disproportionate impact. I'm sympathetic to the concern about, if we only have cameras in certain neighborhoods, then maybe that isn't fair. But I also think, those, whether it's DNA, whether it's cameras, they're going to be better at helping us catch the right people. And so on average, I would expect to see, a drop in wrongful convictions, which are going to disproportionately affect people from these disadvantaged groups that have been targeted perhaps by police historically. I think that, there is really strong evidence that putting more police on the streets, increasing police patrols, that's effective at reducing crime. And also, police are human beings and they're going to be biased too, right? And so the more we can rely on cameras versus people, I think I'm more confident that that'll push us in a direction where we have not only more deterrence, but more fairness across the system.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll have to call it there. And you've both been very patient sitting there for a long time. Thank you so much, Jen.
Thanks,
everyone should go and buy Jennifer's book.
Oh, thank you.
I'm sure you can find that on the internet. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very nice meeting. We can now go to morning tea, and I'll see you later on in the plenary sessions.